What daily life was really like in ancient Egypt, what they didn't teach you about Egypt. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine towering pyramids, golden tombs, and powerful pharaohs. But behind the monuments and the kings were millions of ordinary Egyptians whose lives built the foundations of this civilization. Today, we're stepping away from the palaces and temples to ask, what was daily life like for the average Egyptian? From what they ate to where they lived, from their jobs to their beliefs about the afterlife, this is the story of the people who made ancient Egypt one of the most enduring civilizations in history. Chapter 1, Homes and Amp, Family Life. While the pharaohs lived in palaces and priests resided in temples, the majority of Egyptians called modest mudbrick houses their home. These bricks were made by mixing mud with straw, drying them in the hot sun, and stacking them into walls. Over time, the bricks often crumbled, which is why so few common homes have survived compared to stone temples and tombs. A typical house for an ordinary farmer or worker had 2 or 3 rooms, small windows to keep out the heat, and flat roofs where families often slept during the cooler nights of summer. Some families used their roofs for storing food or drying vegetables. Wealthier Egyptians lived in larger, painted houses with courtyards, wells, and even small gardens where they grew fruit trees, herbs, or papyrus plants. Inside, furniture was simple but functional. Most families had low wooden stools, woven mats, reed baskets, and small wooden tables. Beds were rare for commoners, many slept on mats or directly on the floor. Oil lamps made from pottery or alabaster provided light after dark. Family life was central to Egyptian society. Men were typically responsible for farming, fishing, or working on building projects. Women had a wide range of responsibilities. They managed the household, baked bread in clay ovens, brewed beer, spun flax into linen, and raised children. But women could also work outside the home, as midwives, weavers, musicians, or even priestesses in temples. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian society is the status of women. Unlike in many ancient cultures, women in Egypt had legal rights. They could own and inherit property, sign contracts, and even divorce their husbands if the marriage did not work out. Records show women suing in court, running businesses, and passing wealth to their daughters. Children were cherished, and families were often large. Boys were trained to follow their father's profession, while girls learned household skills from their mothers. Childhood toys have been found, carved wooden animals, clay dolls, and miniature board games, proving that play was as important then as it is today. Marriage was considered a natural part of life, often arranged by families but also sometimes based on love. A common phrase in Egyptian writings described a spouse as my brother or my sister, reflecting intimacy and companionship. Unlike in later societies, Egyptian marriages were not religious ceremonies but practical agreements, sealed by living together and sharing property. In short, while their homes were simple, Egyptians placed immense value on family, community, and stability. These everyday bonds provided the foundation on which the entire civilization stood. Chapter 2, Food and Amp, Drink. If you really want to understand how Egyptians lived, look no further than their food. What they ate not only fueled their bodies but also revealed their social class, environment, and even spiritual beliefs. At the very heart of the Egyptian diet were bread and beer. Wheat and barley were the backbone of agriculture, and nearly every meal included them in some form. Bread was made from emmer wheat, a grain that was ground into flour using heavy stone querns. But grinding was no easy task. Tiny bits of stone often ended up in the dough, wearing down people's teeth over time. In fact, mummies show severe dental erosion because of this. Beer was the second essential staple, often described as liquid bread. It was thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic, brewed by fermenting barley loaves in water. Far from just a drink, beer was considered a basic food source and was consumed by men, women, and even children. Workers at pyramid construction sites were famously paid in bread, beer, and onions, the rations that kept them strong. For protein, Egyptians turned to the Nile River, their life source. Fish, catfish, and Nile perch were common catches, while wealthier households dined on goose, duck, and sometimes even beef or mutton. But meat was expensive, so ordinary people usually reserved it for special occasions or festivals. Vegetables grew abundantly along the Nile's fertile banks. Onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, radishes, and lentils were everyday staples. Onions were not just food but also believed to have spiritual power. They were even placed in tombs and wrapped in mummies as symbols of eternal life. Fruit provided sweetness in an otherwise simple diet. Dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates were prized, especially dried figs and dates, which could last for months. Honey was the main sweetener, considered so precious that it was offered to the gods and used in medicines. Spices and seasonings were limited but important. Salt preserved fish and meat, while herbs like coriander, dill, and cumin flavored dishes. The wealthy sometimes imported exotic spices and oils from the Near East, showing just how interconnected Egypt was with the wider ancient world. Meals were often simple but filling. Breakfast might be a piece of bread with onions and beer. Lunch could include stewed vegetables and lentils. Dinner, the largest meal of the day, brought stews, fresh fish, or meat if it was available. For the elite, feasts were lavish, with roasted goose, wine, and desserts like honey cakes. Food wasn't only about survival, it was deeply tied to religion. Egyptians believed the gods themselves needed offerings of bread, beer, and meat. Tomb paintings show endless banquets, symbolizing the eternal nourishment of the soul in the afterlife. To the Egyptians, food was life itself, both in this world and the next. Chapter 3, Work and Amp, Labor. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture golden masks, towering pyramids, and mighty pharaohs. But behind all of this were the ordinary men and women whose labor made the civilization thrive. The greatness of Egypt was not built by kings alone, but by the sweat and skill of its people. Farmers, the backbone of Egypt. The majority of Egyptians were farmers, living in villages along the fertile banks of the Nile. Their entire year revolved around the river's three great seasons: Ahet, the flooding season, when the Nile overflowed and enriched the soil; Pet, the growing season, when fields were planted with wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables; Shemu, the harvest season, when crops were gathered and stored. Farmers used wooden plows pulled by oxen, sickles made from flint, and simple hand tools. It was tough work, but without them, Egypt would have starved. Taxes were often paid in grain, meaning farmers not only fed themselves but also supplied the temples, the army, and the royal court. Craftsmen, masters of skill beyond the fields, skilled craftsmen built the wonders we admire today. Stone carvers shaped statues and obelisks, stonemasons cut massive limestone blocks, and carpenters built furniture, chariots, and boats. Metalworkers forged tools and jewelry, while potters created vessels for food, drink, and ritual. Perhaps the most respected were the scribes, the educated few who could read and write. In a world where most were illiterate, scribes held incredible power. They recorded harvests, tracked taxes, wrote letters, and copied religious texts. To become a scribe was to escape a life of hard labor and join Egypt's educated elite. Builders and laborers, makers of monuments. One of the most enduring myths is that the pyramids were built by slaves. In truth, most evidence suggests they were built by paid workers and conscripted laborers, often farmers during the flood season when fields lay underwater. They lived in organized worker villages near the construction sites, provided with food, beer, and medical care. Excavations have even found bakeries, breweries, and hospitals serving these laborers. It was a massive national effort, tens of thousands working together, showing not only skill but also incredible organization. This cooperation was part of what made Egypt so strong. Women at work. While men filled many trades, women also played an essential role beyond the home. Some became weavers, perfume makers, midwives, musicians, or dancers. In rare cases, women could even rise to positions of great power, serving as priestesses or even ruling as pharaoh, like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra centuries later. A society built on labor. Every class of worker, from the farmer tending onions to the scribe writing records, contributed to Egypt's survival. Without their constant effort, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, and no golden treasures to fill tombs. In truth, the daily grind of these ordinary people was the hidden engine behind the glory of ancient Egypt. Chapter 4, Clothing and Amp. Style. Clothing in ancient Egypt was simple, practical, and deeply connected to the climate. With the desert sun blazing down and the Nile providing fertile ground, most Egyptians wore light, breathable garments made from linen, woven from flax plants. Men's clothing. For ordinary men, the standard outfit was the shind, a simple kilt or wraparound skirt tied at the waist. Farmers and laborers wore little more than this, especially while working in the heat. Wealthier men wore pleated versions of the shind, sometimes reaching the calf, and added fine linen robes or tunics. Nobles often decorated their clothing with beads, embroidery, or even dyed patterns. Women's clothing. Women typically wore straight, ankle-length linen dresses with straps over the shoulders. These dresses, called calasiris, varied from plain and practical to elegant and form-fitting. Wealthier women wore finer linen, sometimes so sheer it looked almost transparent, along with jewelry and colorful beadwork. Some noble women draped shawls or capes over their shoulders to show status. Children's clothing. Interestingly, small children often wore little or no clothing until they reached adolescence. This was practical in the hot climate and allowed for easy movement while working or playing. As they grew older, they began wearing miniature versions of adult garments. Hair and amp. Wigs. Appearance was incredibly important in Egyptian society. Men often shaved their heads or kept their hair short, while women grew theirs long. But for both men and women, wigs were extremely popular. These wigs could be simple or elaborate, made from human hair or plant fibers, and styled with braids, curls, and decorations. Priests, by contrast, shaved their heads completely as a sign of ritual purity. Pharaohs and nobles wore ceremonial headpieces, such as the Nem's headdress, to show authority. Cosmetics and amp. Beauty cosmetics were not just for women, both men and women used them daily. The most iconic was kohl, a black eyeliner made from galena or soot, which outlined the eyes. Not only was it considered beautiful, but it also reduced glare from the sun and helped prevent eye infections. They also used green malachite for eyeshadow, red ochre for lips and cheeks, and scented oils for the skin. With the harsh desert air, oils and ointments were essential to keep skin from drying out. Perfumes made from lotus, myrrh, and frankincense were prized luxuries, often reserved for the wealthy and for temple rituals. Jewelry was worn by nearly everyone, regardless of class. Beaded necklaces, amulets, rings, and bracelets served not just as decoration but also as protection. Egyptians believed amulets carried magical powers, warding off evil spirits and bringing good fortune. The scarab beetle amulet was especially popular, symbolizing rebirth and protection. The role of appearance. For Egyptians, clothing and beauty were not just about fashion, they reflected order, status, and even religious beliefs. To appear clean, perfumed, and well-dressed was a way of showing respect to the gods and to society. Even the poorest tried to maintain neatness, proving that personal appearance was central to the Egyptian way of life. Chapter 5, Religion and Beliefs. For the ancient Egyptians, religion was not just something practiced in temples, it was woven into every part of daily life. From the rising of the sun to the flooding of the Nile, everything was seen as the work of the gods. A world of gods. Egyptian religion was polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Each god had specific powers and responsibilities. The sun god Ra was perhaps the most important, believed to sail across the sky each day in his solar boat, bringing light and life. Osiris, lord of the afterlife, judged the souls of the dead. Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, protected families. Even local villages had their own deities, worshipped alongside the great state gods. Religion in daily life. Ordinary Egyptians prayed at small household shrines, offering food, flowers, or incense. Amulets of gods and sacred animals were worn around the neck for protection. Cats, linked to the goddess Bastet, were treated as sacred protectors of the home, while scarabs symbolized rebirth and good fortune. Temples, however, were not for the general public. Only priests and priestesses could enter the innermost sanctuaries where the gods' statues were kept. For common people, religion came alive during festivals. These were lively public events with music, dancing, feasts, and processions, when the sacred statues of the gods were carried out of the temples and shown to the people. Belief in the afterlife. Perhaps the most defining feature of Egyptian religion was their belief in the afterlife. They imagined death not as an end but as a transition to another world, a continuation of life, if the soul was judged worthy. To reach this paradise, known as the Field of Reeds, the deceased had to pass a spiritual test. In the famous weighing of the heart ceremony, the heart of the dead was weighed against the feather of Maut, the goddess of truth and order. If the heart was pure, the soul was allowed to enter the afterlife. If not, it was devoured by the fearsome demon Amit. This belief drove their elaborate burial practices. Tombs were stocked with food, tools, furniture, and even board games, everything the deceased might need in the next world. The Book of the Dead, filled with spells and prayers, was placed with the body to guide the soul through the dangers of the underworld. The importance of Maut. Central to Egyptian religion was the concept of Maut, truth, justice, and balance. Egyptians believed that both the universe and society functioned best when Maut was upheld. Pharaohs were seen as guarantors of Maut, responsible for keeping order in both the natural and human worlds. A spiritual everyday life. For the common Egyptian, religion was not something distant or abstract. It was in the amulet around their neck, the prayers spoken at dawn, the offerings left at a shrine, and the hope that their loved ones would one day join them in the afterlife. Chapter 6, Education and Entertainment. Life in ancient Egypt wasn't only about farming, building, or praying. People also made time for fun, relaxation, and social connection. Entertainment was woven into daily life, with games, music, sports, and festivals giving Egyptians joy and a sense of community. Games and pastimes. Board games were hugely popular across all classes. The most famous was Senet, a game played on a rectangular board, with 30 squares. It wasn't just for fun. Senet also had spiritual meaning, symbolizing the soul's journey to the afterlife. Kings like Tutankhamun were even buried with Senate boards to continue playing in eternity. Another favorite was Mayan, known as the game of the snake. The board was shaped like a coiled serpent, with players moving pieces along its winding body. Children also played with dolls, carved wooden animals, and simple toys like spinning tops and balls. Music and amp. Dance music was at the heart of Egyptian leisure and worship. Harps, flutes, lutes, and percussion instruments like drums and sistrums, rattles, filled the air at both family gatherings and temple ceremonies. Professional musicians and dancers entertained at banquets, while ordinary families made music at home. Songs often praised the gods, but they also celebrated love, joy, and daily life. Dance, too, was highly valued, performed in rituals, festivals, and social events. Dancers were often accompanied by clapping, chanting, and the beat of drums. Sports and amp, physical fun sports were another favorite pastime. Egyptians enjoyed wrestling, boxing, archery, and stick fighting, activities that honed strength and skill. Swimming and boating on the Nile were common leisure activities, especially for children and young men. Fishing and hunting were both practical and recreational, with nobles often shown on painted tomb walls hunting in the marshes. Banquets and amp, feasts for the wealthy, leisure often meant hosting lavish banquets. These events featured food, wine, beer, and endless entertainment. Guests sat on cushions, musicians played, and dancers performed. Even perfumes were part of the experience. Guests sometimes wore cones of scented wax on their heads that slowly melted, releasing fragrance throughout the evening. Festivals for ordinary Egyptians. Some of the most joyful times were during religious festivals. These were public celebrations with music, food, games, and processions. They gave everyone, rich or poor, a chance to join in communal joy, and honor the gods together. Everyday joy. In truth, leisure was not just about luxury. Even the simplest joys, a family sharing bread, children playing with toys by the Nile, or neighbors chatting in the shade, reveal that Egyptians valued balance in life. Just as work and religion were important, so too were moments of laughter, play, and rest. Chapter 7, Challenges of Daily Life. While ancient Egypt is often remembered for its wealth and grandeur, everyday life was not without difficulty. For the common Egyptian, survival meant facing challenges that were part of daily existence. The demands of farming. Though the Nile's floods provided fertile soil, farming was physically exhausting and unpredictable. Too little flooding meant poor harvests and hunger, while too much flooding could destroy fields and homes. Farmers worked long hours under the burning sun, bending over crops, hauling water, and battling pests. Locusts, rats, and crop diseases could devastate entire harvests. Disease and amp, health struggles. Medical knowledge was advanced for its time, but diseases were common. The Nile Valley's warm, humid environment encouraged parasites and infections. Malaria, tuberculosis, and intestinal worms plagued many people. Injuries from labor, such as broken bones or infected cuts, were frequent. Dental problems were especially severe. Coarse bread ground with stone tools left teeth worn down and painful. Heavy labor and amp, building projects. Massive state projects, like temples and pyramids, demanded huge numbers of workers. While many laborers were paid in food and beer, the work was backbreaking and dangerous. Stone quarrying, hauling blocks, and long hours in the sun tested human endurance. Even with organization and care, accidents and exhaustion were common. Social inequality. Life could be very different depending on one's social class. Wealthy families enjoyed luxury, fine clothes, and feasts, while the poor struggled to make ends meet. Farmers and workers paid heavy taxes in grain and labor, supporting the temples and elite, often leaving them with little for themselves. Women had more rights than in many ancient cultures, but opportunities were still limited compared to men. Natural hardships: the desert environment was harsh. Sandstorms, scorching summers, and limited rainfall made daily life a constant battle against nature. Clean water was mostly available from the Nile, but pollution from waste and animals sometimes made it unsafe, especially near large settlements. The shadow of death: high infant mortality meant many children did not survive past early childhood. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Most people lived only into their 30s or 40s, though the wealthy sometimes lived longer. Death was a constant presence, which may explain why Egyptians placed such strong emphasis on the afterlife. Resilience of the people: and yet, despite these challenges, Egyptians endured for thousands of years. They adapted their farming, developed medicine, built strong communities, and found joy in family, religion, and festivals. Their resilience is what allowed their civilization to last longer than almost any other in history. Finally, the story of ancient Egypt isn't just about kings, queens, and monuments. It's about the millions of ordinary people whose lives made the civilization possible. They built the pyramids, fed the nation, raised families, and passed down traditions that still fascinate us today. So the next time you see the pyramids of Giza or the temples of Luxor, remember, behind every stone is the unseen hand of a common Egyptian, living an ordinary life in an extraordinary civilization. Right pointing finger emoji: what part of daily Egyptian life surprised you the most? Would you want to live as a farmer, a scribe, or a craftsman? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into the secrets of ancient Egypt and beyond.